Takes a little time, 13 months, a little time. All right, let's bring in Moshe Lander. He is a professor of economics at Concordia. He's been following the NAFTA file extensively in recent months. So what did you make of what Donald Trump said here? Because again, Moshe, we really see that it's about dairy for the president. He's talked about this for a long, long time, about dairy farmers in Wisconsin and elsewhere being badly impacted by the Canadian government and what he calls protectionism.
It's true. Dairy farmers in this country are protected. There is a high tariff that's placed on imported goods that come into this country from the U.S. What doesn't seem to be mentioned is that the U.S. supports its own dairy farmers with high tariffs as well. So he's right if he says that Canada needs to remove its support for dairy farmers, but we're not making enough of a counter-argument saying, we'll put that on the table if you're prepared to start eliminating support for your dairy farmers, corn producers, and other farm industry agricultural products that are going on in the U.S. that are subsidized as well.
And we want to be clear here. I mean, there are about 10,000 dairy farmers in Canada. Half of them are in Quebec, the rest primarily Ontario and British Columbia. So I've got to ask you this. I mean, we're not talking about opening up the market entirely to the Americans. We're talking about opening up a portion of it, a slight amount, a couple of percentage points, for example, much like Canada did with European dairy products recently.
Yeah, I mean, really what you're looking at is the strength of the Canadian dairy farmer lobby. The fact is that Canadian consumers would actually stand to benefit by forcing open that sector to competition. Any dairy consumer would see prices at the grocery store go down and would also see less of our tax dollars being given to support an inefficient dairy industry, which is effectively why they need the protection in the first place. So it's really just kind of the strength of their lobby.
So what you're saying is if this was to happen, we would get cheaper milk and cheaper cheese and other dairy products. So why don't we do it?
The consumer doesn't realize what's going on. It's a very easy political sell to try and put kind of the farmer's way of life as something that's inherently Canadian. Every country does that. They can dress it up as food security, or they could dress it up as part of the way of life. Or settlers who came to the province of Quebec 375 years ago were farmers, and we need to protect that part of Canadian culture. And that goes down well with a voter who doesn't realize that the cost of that protection is higher grocery bills, less disposable income for other things, and higher taxes to pay for that.
The Canadian government has signaled a certain willingness, Moshe, if you kind of read between the lines here, and actually read some of the comments that have been said pretty overtly, that we are willing to look at the dairy sector and that in all likelihood there could be a deal here. What do you think we're going to see?
Yeah, I think if you start putting it in perspective where you're talking about that Canada-U.S. trade, let's set aside Mexico, and we're talking about the trade between the two countries is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and the amount of economic impact that we would stand to be harmed by if we don't come up with some sort of NAFTA agreement. I don't want to say sacrificing 10,000 farmers, but subjecting them to a little bit of competition is not necessarily a bad thing here, and that might force them to be a little more efficient and a little more kind of cost effective. So I think that putting dairy on the table is probably a very low cost strategy for Canada at this point as a way to move negotiations forward, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Based on what you've heard from Donald Trump, do you think that would be enough if Canada was to say, okay, we're going to open up our market to some of these American dairy farmers, allow you to sell some of your product in Canada, something that sort of is reasonable, that would be enough for Trump?
I don't know that it's ever enough for him. You're kind of dealing with an unpredictable wild man who seems to just kind of have mood swings that today it's good enough and tomorrow it's not. It's can you keep his Twitter account away from him, and can you keep him focused on the main exercise? I think that it's certainly something that needs to be done. Whether that's the sufficient condition, you know, who knows? And he needs to be able to go back to his voters and say that he has won. That's really all he wants to do, is to say that he won. Not that he's going to bring benefits, but if he can say that somehow he won, he beat down Canada, then yeah, that might be enough.
And one last point. I mean, is there not a way for those farmers, Moshe, and how powerful they can be with voters? We know there's a provincial election where you are in Quebec, 1st of October. There's a federal election a year from now, that those farmers could somehow be subsidized. So in other words, you open up the market. If they lose a couple of $1 billion spread out, then the Canadian government could step in and offer some subsidies directly to those farmers.
I don't know necessarily that you'd want to even offer subsidies in the first place. The thing that always comes into my mind is that if you want to help farmers through kind of the cyclicality and the ups and downs, I think it's the way that all of us deal with the cyclicality of up and down of income or anything like that, which is create a market for insurance. Create some sort of system where you can provide price supports through their own means, where in times that are good and times that are bad, they can essentially subsidize themselves. If the government needs to get involved in that type of market to help make it deep and functional, that's fine. But beyond that, I think that the best way to do it is make these farms much larger in size and drive their cost of production lower.
Moshe Lander joining us from Montreal with his take on the NAFTA talks getting set to restart again tonight. Chrystia Freeland heading down to Washington. Moshe, thank you for this again today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.